Good afternoon. Today we'll be talking about prison reform. As a child, when you get in trouble, your mom told you to go sit in the corner and go to your room and think about what you've done. The prison system, in my opinion, has become the same thing. The biggest difference is that after you think about what you've done, mom would always reinforce the message and let you know the consequences for what you've done that is wrong. There's been a lot of changes in the prison system since the beginning, but much more is still required, like I said, in my opinion, to ensure that the time spent in their adult time out is more beneficial, all the while they are still treated like humans. We'll be covering several changes that have taken place, especially from the early years of prisons. I will let you know what happens when unkept prisons get out of control, and we'll cover many changes that need to take place to ensure that what needs to be done is accomplished. First, we'll talk about the early years. What were the foundations for corrections over the past two centuries? Well, during the 19th century, an offenders experienced physical pain and torture as punishment for committing crimes. Corporal punishment was often used, and most of the time punishment were carried out in public. The purpose of this is to deter others and, in many cases, to humiliate the offender. The facilities were unkept. The system was unorganized. Prisoners were free to roam. The lack of guards were extremely evident. Inmates had to provide their own food and clothing. Eventually, the goal became punitive, and prisons were used to punish offenders. Another issue that I see are political and social climate. It is obvious that during the 50s and 60s, civil rights issues were everywhere included, including the prison system. Each of these civil rights movements, whether it be race, whether it be political, social issues, increased, especially in certain minority groups, power and influence in the prisons. Finally, between 1900 and 1930s, we saw some major changes. During that time span, 17 women prisons were founded across the country. Many of these issues are the biggest things that we've seen that have originally been reformed, but we still have a long ways to go. Next, we'll talk about prison rights, which is a big issue. Overcrowding is the majority of the issue when it comes to prison rights, as well as prison conditions. Although jails generally operate under stated capacities, all state and federal prisons are overcrowded, many as much as 33% higher than official capacities. From July 2002 to 2003, the number of state and federal prisons grew approximately 2.9%, the largest increase to date. To further carry my point, we'll discuss some of the worst prison riots in U.S. history. First, we'll talk about the one that happened in Attica Correctional Facility in Attica, New York in 1971. An uprising by prison inmates of the Attica facility, which was a maximum security prison, ended in the bloodiest prison confrontation in American history. 1,300 prisoners rebelled and took 40 guards hostage. After negotiations failed, state police and National Guard troops seized the prison. In the course of the reconquest, they killed 43 individuals, including 10 hostages. Next, New Mexico State Penitentiary, Santa Fe, New Mexico, in 1980. This was maybe not the bloodiest, but one of the most violent in American history. Negotiations between law enforcement and rebels stalled, and after 36 hours, armed police troopers and National Guard servicemen retook the compound. In the end, 33 inmates lay dead, 200 were injured, and 12 officers taken hostage. Only 7 were injured. Third one that we'll cover today is probably one of the biggest ones, and although it wasn't the bloodiest, it wasn't the most violent, it's probably one that most prisons have the biggest issues with today in the vast majority of different social and religious differences of prisoners that are in there. This took place in Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, Ohio in 1993. On Easter Sunday, 450 inmates rioted. In this maximum security prison, the disturbance occurred due to fear among Muslim inmates that correctional officials would force prisoners to have tuberculosis vaccinations. Taking these vaccinations would have violated the prisoners' faith. The inmates rebelled for 10 days and took 8 prison guards hostage. The violence claimed the lives of 4 prison inmates and correctional officials. Due to all these, those were 3 great issues that I feel that specifically show the reform that is needed. Some of the continued reform that I feel that need to take place. One of the biggest would be inmate education. I have family members that have worked in different areas in the prison system. I've come to learn about many of the issues in inmate education. Many of the riots that we spoke about, yes, were due to facility issues, but also educational programs that have been taken away. My father, he worked for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice with no prior correctional experience. He was merely a certified electrician, and one of the jobs that he had was to take inmates that were getting ready to be released, also known as trustees, and teach them how to fix different electrical issues. By doing so, the inmates will have skills and be able to get a job when getting out. Due to different budget cuts, many of these programs have been taken away, so when inmates are released, they're in the same situation as they were when they were put in. So they'll most likely continue to commit crimes, and it'll be a rotating cycle. The next reform that we need to take a look at is going to be guard pay, and like I said a while ago, the education of the guards. Many of the issues that caused the riots were also enabled by lack of training of prison guards. Many of the experienced guards leave the prison system for higher paying jobs. Because they are losing experienced guards, the prison system is forced to bring in civilians with little experience to try to control these criminals. In such cases, they lose control or mistreat the inmates, which in turn retaliate. Third would be facility reform. In almost every case of riot, the major contributing factor is facility related. The vast majority of prisons are outdated or too small for the large, diverse inmates that are trying to be kept in them. With that being said, many of the updated prisons are almost too comfortable. Many of the inmates have better amenities than a large percentage of the population that hasn't committed any crimes at all. Yes, they need to be up to date, but at the same time, they don't need to be too comfortable. In some prisons, the inmates are used as laborers. Not only do they produce items that are used by the state, such as license plates, but in many places they have farms that produce food to self-facilitate the prisons. In doing so, it cuts down on some of the expenses needed to feed the inmates. This would be useful in a lot of prisons around the country. Rather than having to purchase everything, allow the inmates to grow the food, which would not only cut down on the cost, but also keep them busy and teach them a skill. So in conclusion, researchers from many disciplines using many methods study the prisons, and many more should in the future. Adding up the number of people admitted to or held in prisons and jails, especially since the early years, the people who work in these situations and the training and education that received, and the direct result of what happens when they are not kept correctly. Any social institution affecting so many people should receive much more attention from scholars than prisons do now. Norval Morris, a researcher of prison systems, has often said, prisoners are a microcosm of society, and if we study them, we learn more about ourselves. That is another, perhaps the best reason for increased investment in prison reform. Thank you.